Yeah, so I'm Koji Chavez. I'm in my second year here, and I was asked to give this presentation, so it's an honor and a privilege to be here. So today I'll be talking a little bit about how bias works in selection decisions, particularly in hiring decisions. So actually, full disclosure, I haven't been on a hiring committee here at the university yet, but I have studied hiring in other contexts, in corporate contexts. And so hopefully some of the things that I talk about will be transferable to all of you as you go through your hiring searches. So I'll talk a little bit about implicit bias and how social psychologists think it works, and then we'll go through a number of policy solutions or best practices that have been shown to be somewhat effective in terms of combating implicit bias. And so, I'm not going to give you a whole list of things that I think you should do, but maybe picking up one or two to implement in your hiring searches might be nice. Okay. So first, just some examples of what stereotypes look like, how they are very common in everyday sort of life. I was thinking through some examples in my own life here at IU, and one came to mind. I remember a student came up to me after class. I teach a race ethnicity course. I'm teaching a work in society course. I forgot which. He was in the work in society course. And after class, he comes to my office hours, and he's like, the moment you walked in, I knew this class was going to be fun. And I was thinking, like, well, why did he think that the moment I walked in, right? Maybe because I'm younger than his other professors. He was a business student, right? So maybe he had some preconceived notions about what sociology was all about, right? So he was using stereotypes to sort of affect his perceptions about who I was as a professor, right? But you can think of this in all different types of situations. One of my colleagues had a student come up to him with a question about who he should choose as a tutor, and he had this list of tutors out, right? And he tells my colleague, oh, I just picked the name that was probably the best tutor. My colleague's like, oh, how did you choose that? What was up with the name? And it was the most, Eastern European sounding name on the list, right? So he was using stereotypes. He was thinking about stereotypes about who he thought was a good tutor, and he was using that to influence his perceptions, influence his decision making, really without really thinking through it, right? And there's a bunch of these examples that we could think about that happen in our everyday life, right? Now, what are some common features about how stereotypes typically influence our decision making? Well, often they occur unconsciously, right? In these decisions that I talked about a moment ago, in the one that my student was making, it's probably done unconsciously, right? They're not consciously thinking about a stereotype and saying, I'm going to apply this stereotype to my evaluation, or I'm going to apply the stereotype to my decision. It doesn't usually happen. And we're not often aware that the stereotypes are affecting our decisions, affecting our perceptions, and yet they often are, right? And social psychologists have talked about this over and over. Another important point, just a general point about stereotypes, is that you don't have to endorse the stereotypes or believe in them for them to have an effect on your perceptions and your evaluations, right? That's often a common misconception. Another element of stereotypes that I think is important is that we often rely on them, again, subconsciously or unconsciously, when we're busy, right? When we're thinking about other things, also when we're like frustrated or angry, all these sort of things where we're not really paying attention to the task at hand. Oftentimes stereotypes will affect our evaluation, affect our perceptions. Right? And this doesn't mean that this is a process that is inevitable, right? So we do know that we can sort of interrupt the stereotyping process if we just put in a little bit of effort, right? But it does take a little bit of effort to do so. Okay, so where do stereotypes come from? I'm starting at the most basic foundations of stereotypes and evaluations. So what stereotypes come from is we typically associate two or more concepts together over repeated exposure over time, right? So one simple way to think about this is, you might have a favorite song, and when you think about that favorite song, you're thinking about maybe what you were doing when you first heard it or who you heard it with, right? And we associate those two things together in our heads. So for me, whenever I hear "Drop It Like It's Hot" by Snoop Dogg, I think of the time that I was driving from my parents' house in Irvine to Santa Barbara, where I went to college, and me and my college roommate, we memorized all the words to that song over that 2.5-hour drive. So when I hear that song, I associate it with a specific experience, right? So if I said peanut butter and, you all would say jelly. If I said rum and Coke, right? So you associate these words together, right? That's essentially how stereotypes work, right? Thinking about one of these concepts brings up the other one because they're associated in your head. Yeah? That's true. That is true, right? So the specific content of stereotype might differ in different cultural contexts, right? No, that is true. That is true. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, it is sort of weird to have peanut butter and jelly in some places, right? It's a strange sort of combination of things. So here, though, right, it doesn't mean, so even though you're thinking about these concepts together, it doesn't mean you're endorsing them. So you could be thinking about peanut butter and jelly, but it doesn't mean that you like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. It doesn't mean that you want one right now. It's just you are associating those two things together in your head. So how social psychologists, how sociologists, and I guess psychologists, think about stereotypes is often different from our common sense notion of how stereotypes work, or who is actually using stereotypes to evaluate people or perceive people, right? So the common misunderstanding about how bias works in general is that there are bad people out there that are prejudiced and they use stereotypes and they, are unfair in their evaluations and they're just like bad people, right? And that's compared to good people that are unbiased, that don't use stereotypes, that are very pure, right? And we have this image in our head. There's a classic Bill Burr skit, not skit, but a bit that he does where he talks about how racism is shown in movies where it's always this old guy with like a vein coming out of the side of his head, like yelling at people, right? That's sort of this image that we have of how prejudice works, of how racism works in general. But that's not really how it works in most of the time in real life. And I would say that, obviously sometimes this is true, right? There are people that hold prejudiced beliefs, and that is true. But in general, right, stereotypes work at an implicit level, at an unconscious level, right? It's not that people are consciously thinking about these stereotypes or believing in these beliefs. They just sort of affect our actions at the unconscious level, right? And everyone has these stereotypes. Everyone knows what these stereotypes are. We just, they become associated in our head. So it's not this image, right, of good and bad people. That is not really how it works. It's something that happens to everyone. And even if we reject this stereotype, we don't believe it, it still can affect our behavior, it still can affect our perceptions, affect our evaluations. Right? That's sort of the power of stereotypes in general. They're very, very powerful. So what I'm getting at here is that, this common sense notion of good and bad people, either, the good people don't stereotype, the bad people do, it makes it hard, right, when thinking about how stereotypes actually work, right? Because it's something that affects most people, or everyone is affected by stereotypes at the unconscious level. Right? Okay. So, yeah, I know. I'm going to talk. Well, actually, that sort of relates to my anecdote, right? Where I'm not that bearded. I do have a mustache, though. But I'm not that bearded professor, right? So maybe they thought it was fun. So what are stereotypes? Stereotypes are a fixed set of characteristics that is attributed to all members of a given group, right? Okay, that's. Stereotypes can be explicit or implicit. And there's just this assumption that people within that group hold those stereotypes to a certain degree, right? And it's important here to know that, stereotypes can be both positive and negative. So you can hold stereotypes of a certain group that are both positive and negative. You can hold both those things in your head at the same time. So they're not all negative. They're oftentimes inaccurate, right? And this is important. Your stereotypical beliefs or widely held beliefs about a certain group, they can often be very difficult to change, right? And one reason why this would be is something that we call subtyping, right? Where you have these larger stereotypes, let's say, about gender, right? But they really don't apply to the people that you know because they're different, right, than the other group, right? That's sort of this subtyping that we do. That's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to change the overall stereotypes that we hold. Right? And then another thing, and this is also a misconception, I think, is that we often think of people thinking of their group as good and having good stereotypes about their group, bad stereotypes about an outgroup. That's oftentimes not really how it works. I mean, you can hold negative stereotypes even about your own group. Right? That's another sort of misconception that we have. So in general, this process of stereotyping that I think, well, what we're talking about today is part of a larger process of what we do cognitively just to make sense of our world, right? So this is a larger process of us putting things into categories, you know, and when it comes to people, placing people in different groups, right? And the reason why we do this at a cognitive level is because it just makes it faster for us to interpret information, right? So you could imagine a world where we didn't do any of this, right? And we just, you know, got all this information into our eyes, and we had to, like, in that moment, decipher what was going on. That'd be a lot. That would be a cognitive overload for you every day, right? So our brain uses stereotypes. In a larger sense, it makes these categories, right, to make it easier for us to understand and interpret the information that we are receiving. Now, the downside to this is oftentimes it could lead to errors. It could lead to overgeneralizations, right? So this is something that we just have to keep in mind. You know, so yeah, right, especially when the cultural images don't match the reality. Okay. Now, why are we talking about this? Okay, we're talking about this because of hiring. So the big question is, right, do stereotypes and bias based on those stereotypes affect hiring decisions? And the short answer is yes, they do. So first I'm going to just walk through a little bit of the evidence from audit studies. And I think most of you probably have heard about audit studies. If not what it is, it's a field experiment where experimentals will send out equivalent resumes, so tested to be equivalent, but they're varying certain characteristics on those resumes that they want to study, right? So they might vary the race of the applicant, they might vary the gender, sexual orientation, a lot of different, I've seen one with military experience or not, right? People are testing a lot of different things to see if those characteristics will affect the eventual hiring decision. And what's nice, because it's an experiment, a field experiment, right, you could say that there's a causal relationship between the gender or race or whatever characteristic you're interested in and the final outcome. Now typically here, oh, and it's also important to realize they're applying to real jobs in these audit studies, right? In the old days of, you know, well, they've done audit studies for a while, but Diva Pager was a sociologist that really brought them to the fore. And they would send out actual people. Like, she would train people to go out to job sites. Like, and it was, if you read the old studies, like, it's really interesting because she would train, you know, they would make sure that they're acting the same, talking the same, that they rated them in terms of attractiveness being the same, right? So nowadays, we don't do that as much in terms of real people, but we send out resumes, which makes it a little easier. You can send out a lot of different resumes. Right, so you're varying a few characteristics. Again, it's nice because you can get that causal effect. This would be an example, right? Everything is the same on the resumes except the gender is different, right? I'm running an audit study right now varying gender and race, and you know, how do we do that? We do it essentially just by the name, right? And we can find very large effects by just changing the names on the resumes. The measurement in these audit studies are typically the callback rates, right? So this is, again, the caveat here is that it's nice because you get a causal effect, but the outcome variables is just that first stage of hiring, so just the callback stage. So you gotta, you know, keep that in mind. It's not looking at the final hiring decision, it's just that first callback stage, although the callback stage is important. All right, so what do we find in general based on decades of audit studies? Very clear disadvantage for African Americans in the US, and this is one of the most constant findings over time. I remember there was a review article maybe a few years ago just looking at all the audit studies when it came to race since the 1980s, right, when they first started doing this, and one of the most constant findings is that there is just a penalty for being African American in hiring overall, right? And it doesn't matter your education, experience, across all sort of dimensions we see this effect. There's bias against women at the callback stage. Skilled immigrants, for example, there was one in 2011 looking at Asian immigrants. It was in the Canadian context, but the effects were quite large. Gay men and others, right? We just find that there's a lot of discrimination, and it depends on the sort of characteristics that are in that resume. Actually, one that's missing from here that I forgot to put on here is a motherhood penalty. In fact, that's a huge penalty in hiring. Maybe even more so than just a straight gender penalty. A motherhood penalty is quite large. Okay, so those are all, you know, what I think are some of the best evidence of bias in hiring. Although, again, there's some caveats because it's that first stage of hiring. But there's some other evidence I think is important, right? So there's a classic study by Golden and Rouse that looks at hiring in orchestras. All of you have probably heard about this if you've seen any lecture about bias, because this is the first thing that they talk about. But it's important, I think, because it's a very innovative type study. And they were studying orchestras. Orchestras are historically very male-dominated, right? And what they found was that orchestras that started using a blind audition, right? So people go up and play their instrument, they put a blind curtain in front. They saw that those orchestras were starting to, women were more likely to get advanced in the hiring process, eventually become part of the orchestra when those screens and curtains were used, right? So the idea is that the people that were judging, they couldn't really tell the gender of the person, and so that gender bias went away in the evaluations. Now what's interesting here is that sometimes there was still a gender bias even though they were using a screen, right? So why do you think that was? Why do you think they could still tell there was a gender, they could still tell the gender of the person playing, but why do you think that was if they still had the screen up? The shoes, right? They could hear the click-clack of the high heels.
I'm an orchestra conductor.
Oh, there you go, right? So this is a classic. Right, and so this is the thing, right? Then they put the carpet down and then the gender difference went away, right? So some other examples, there was a study of 3,000 R&D scientists and engineers, right? And net of any possible measures of productivity among these engineers, this is across all different corporations, education, publications, patents, experience, even measured personality traits and relational type skills. Men were still rated more positively by managers. Again, this is correlational. You can control for a lot of stuff, but it still fits this sort of pattern. And this is the perception of discrimination among 7,000 NSF postdoctoral fellowship winners, where if you looked at the difference between perceived discrimination among men and women, about 75% of women say that they perceive discrimination in their tenure, right, whereas there are only 13% of men. So that is perception, but again, this is part of this larger story of bias in these sort of selection processes. I guess this goes back to my first example. So, stereotypes also affect, because it affects perception, it affects how students perceive us, right? So here you're thinking about teaching evaluation specifically, right? How students perceive us really depends on, or is affected by stereotypes, right? And so I'll just talk about a few studies. Right, so this one was done at Waterloo, and what they found was that they were looking at the evaluations of men and women across different fields, and what they found was that male and female instructors would give students, equal grades. So essentially, it didn't matter the gender of your instructor. You have the same chance of getting an A, no matter the gender of the instructor. Now, the evaluations of the male and female instructors were the same if those students did well in the class, right? So they would evaluate the male and female instructors the same, but among the students who received the very lowest scores, so if they didn't do that well in the course, then you see this gender difference in terms of evaluations, right? So then the women instructors were not very good teachers relative to the men, right? And so one thing to think about here, what are some of the long-term implications when it comes to how do we use this information? A woman who might get worse evaluations from students, maybe her department might think, oh, she wasn't a good fit for that course. Maybe she should prep another course, right? So the idea is here, just think about what is happening with these evaluations. There could be some bias in terms of how people are perceived. I mean, what these studies really make me think, and I think we all sort of know this, right, if you teach undergrads. I remember the first time I taught in grad school, I immediately saw that there was a gender difference in how I was being perceived, right? And I was only a grad student, but I remember I just realized that students would take me seriously. I could say whatever, and they would just take me seriously, compared to my female colleagues who would say, the students aren't taking me seriously. We're teaching the same thing, and they were probably more confident than I was. But you could just tell, right? And they would have to dress a little better. They would have to act more professional, whereas I had leeway not to. And that was simply because the people were using gender stereotypes to interpret our competence levels. Right? Okay. So where else do we find evidence of gender bias and in places that are applicable to hiring here? Well, one is that we see there's very gender differences in terms of how recommenders are even talking about those people that they are recommending. Right, so this is a study of 300 recommendation letters to U.S. med schools, right? And even taking into account the productivity levels of the candidates themselves or the people that are applying to these jobs, if you just looked at the letters and how they're worded differently, women tended to have shorter letters than men, right? Men tended to have longer letters, so their recommenders were willing to write more for men. In those letters, the recommenders would bring up more doubts about the candidate's ability to enter academia, or I guess here be a doctor. And then even in the style of writing, they found that there was a gender difference. So for women, they would often talk about her teaching, her training, her application, right? For men, it was often his research, his skills and ability, and his career, right? So all this kind of stuff, even though it might seem nuanced and small, I mean, that sort of stuff matters when you're reading through an application very quickly, right? And so, right, we do see these gender differences here in terms of evaluations, or recommendations. Okay, so what about within the hiring committee? So just as a sidetrack, so part of my research looks at hiring committees, although in a corporate setting, looking at hiring of software engineers, and there I specifically find how gender really does come up when people are evaluating people's skills, right? So what I find is that even among men and women at these companies that are evaluated equally in terms of technical ability, when it comes to the deliberation, what becomes emphasized are typically gendered ways, or gendered strengths and weaknesses, right? Now I haven't sat in on a hiring committee here at the university. I'm a new professor, but other people have. Other sociologists have sat in on hiring committees. And what they have found was that what is a very salient conversation, one that differs by the gender of the candidate, is whether they are movable or not. And this is specifically about partners, right? And so, you know, if the candidate is a female candidate and she has, let's say, a male partner, the conversation is about that relational status and whether the man is willing to move or not, right? That's where the conversation is. Is he really going to move? Because the assumption is he probably has a really good job, he's in a great place. What can we do to get him to move? If the candidate is a male and he has a female partner, that conversation about what the partner is going to do is not really on the table, right? This study was actually done at Harvard, by the way. I don't know if you're supposed to know this. So the conversation about the relational, the partner changes based on the gender of the candidate. So this is, you know, I'll just read the beginning of this, right? They're talking about a female candidate here in this evaluation setting. One person says, she seems to have the highest potential based on limited information. Another person says, her market is good so far. She has, you know, basically all these other offers. They really liked her. Some people think it's unlikely she'd come because of her boyfriend. He has a really good job. He's in a great city for that job, right? And so they're really talking about the boyfriend's job and whether they can get him to move. That conversation is quite different if it's a male candidate, because the assumption is, right, that women would be more willing to move for their male partner. So those are just some areas in which we think stereotypes and bias could affect things that are relevant to your hiring, what goes on in the hiring committee. So what are some ways to reduce the role of implicit bias? Well, first, it's important to go back and just think about what we're talking about here, right? So stereotypes are just this unconscious shortcut that we use. We use them more when we're just distracted, when we're stressed, when we're rushed, right? And so that's sort of the context in which all this stuff happens. Another thing to keep in mind is that typically training doesn't work, so just listening to me talk is not going to do anything, right? And this is a known thing. If you remember, like Starbucks did like this unbiased conscious training. I would love to see if there are any effects on that, because there probably are not. And so we don't find, I mean, there might be like short-term effects. Well, we could talk about that afterwards. But long-term, no, right? So just training, just telling people about it doesn't really do anything. What does something, right, is if you instill some practices. Now, what I'm not saying to like change entirely your hiring structure, but just think about, you know, one or two things that you could sort of tweak, right? So these are very doable type things. Okay, so what's the first category of practices that we know have an effect on reducing bias? Well, one is just general accountability, right? This is big, and there's a number of studies that show the importance of accountability in hiring decisions. And what that means is that accountability is this implicit or explicit expectation that you might have to justify your evaluation or justify your decision, right? So, you know, sort of explaining, what makes this person qualified or unqualified, right? What did you take into account when you made this decision, or what are you thinking about, right, when you're making this decision? And what this really does, it's very simple, right? It just makes you think a little bit more about about your decision-making process, right? How you're evaluating things, and then making you think, like, are gender stereotypes, are racial stereotypes, are immigrant stereotypes sort of influencing this evaluation process? Just think about it a little more, right? Now, what's important here is, this obviously is more effective before you do the decision. If you do it afterwards, that's post hoc rationalization, right? That's just you make a decision and then you rationalize it. So, talking it through before, having some accountability for, making sure that people are applying criteria equally, for example, that should come before the actual hiring decision, right? So the recommendation here would be to structure the search to include explicit justifications for your decisions or for the candidate evaluation, right? And you might already be doing this, which is good. Okay, so what are some other just very basic things that we know help? Well, one is just having transparent evaluation criteria. Like, what are the criteria for hiring someone, right? Making those explicitly clear. Because we know that if they are not clear, oftentimes the criteria can change based on the person that you're evaluating, right? So, in one study, it showed that women needed to publish 2.5 times more to get a postdoctoral fellowship. So things like that, right? The actual evaluations needed differed by gender. Another thing that we see a lot of times is that people will switch which evaluations are more important or which criteria are more important based on the person that they want to hire, right? And so we see this a lot in experimental work where people will actually shift the criteria because they want to hire a certain person, and then so they're shifting what they think is important based on, what can get that person in, right? So making everything transparent, making the criteria transparent beforehand, and understanding that these are things that happen, right, are important to reduce bias in your search. So, right, part of that is clearly defining the search criteria in advance. How much are we going to weigh potential versus accomplishment? How much is teaching weighed? Thinking about which journal articles are more important or which journals are more important for your department and so forth. And of course, movability, which we just talked about, could have some gender dimensions. And what we find is effective here is that having someone like monitoring this, like putting someone in charge of, are our criteria transparent? Are we sort of applying it equally to different people? And this sort of overlaps with the last point of accountability with transparency. Okay, and then, this is a very simple one, but just critically analyzing the materials that you're using based on what we all know in terms of how bias and stereotypes can affect, teaching evaluations, recommendation letters, and so forth, right? So just being cognizant of, demographics could affect, or demographic characteristics could affect people's materials in ways that we know of because of research, right? Again, if you're looking at someone's teaching evaluations and you notice that the worst students tend to score the female candidate worse, well, maybe there could be something going on with bias there, right? And so, yeah, considering how these factors are weighed into the evaluation, knowing that bias could have affected the results. So some final additional suggestions, and this goes back to the idea that stereotypes are most used unconsciously when we are busy, when we're frustrated, when we have somewhere else to be. Try to avoid last-minute decision-making. I know this seems very basic, but it does have an effect on how potent stereotypes are. So try to avoid those last-minute decision-making, rush searches. Another thing that we find effective is making sure that during job talks that the culture is different in different departments in terms of how much you interrupt the job person that's giving the talk, but just make sure it's even across all candidates, right? Because we know that people are more likely to interrupt women during job talks, right? So just be cognizant of that. See if you can create some sort of equality in terms of interruptions during people's job talks. And another good thing, I think, is just to measure your progress over time, right? What do the characteristics of the applicant pool look like? What are the characteristics of the people that eventually get a call back, get an offer, get accepted, right? Because then you have some data that you could use, maybe not for that search, but maybe for next time to say, okay, these are sort of the pressure points, these are the trouble areas that we might need to work on. So measuring is always good. Okay, so that's it. Thank you. I went a little over time, but yeah.